Tonight on the Late Debate, 5 murders in 6 days. The political blame game continues after another bloody week in the capital.
We need to recruit more officers, but also it's not sustainable for these officers to continue to cancel their rest days and work at overtime.
We're joined by Minister for London Nick Hurd as we ask, how do you stop the killings? Plus,
I prepared for the dancing, so light bulb, motorbike, I was all set.
Heading for number 10, but where's the real Boris Johnson? Good evening. It's been another grim week with more young men murdered on the streets of London. We're all becoming weary of the depressing headlines, and for our police officers on the front line, the fatigue is beginning to take its toll.
I meet police officers every day. They're knackered. They really are knackered. They're heartbroken.
Sadiq Khan didn't mince his words.
They're knackered. They're knackered.
The stabbings and shootings are putting a strain on the Met. 300 police are assigned to the new Serious Violence Task Force. Their shifts are at least 12 hours long.
If you're working a 6-day week out on 12-hour shifts, it is hard work.
It's not sustainable for these officers to continue to cancel their rest days and work at overtime.
In the Commons this week, Labour MPs demanded more money for more police.
My constituents are anxious, they're frightened, they see low-level antisocial behaviour escalating to violent crime.
We don't need projects, we need police officers, we don't need overtime payments.
Play football but Theresa May has consistently rejected a link between crime levels and police numbers. This is what she told me in October. Do you accept falling police numbers has contributed to the problem?
If you look over time, actually you'll see there's no direct causation between police numbers and levels of crime.
Shayon Evans was 18. He died last Friday in Tooting. Police say he was stabbed to death.
This senseless violence could have been avoided with adequate policing, good youth provision and giving our young people a sense of hope. Will the Prime Minister use her remaining days in office to leave a legacy which will change the paths for these young people, or can we expect yet more of the same?
This is not just a question. She puts it as a question of funding and police numbers. Actually, it's a much wider issue. Anybody who denies that this is a wider issue for our society is simply failing to understand the issue we have to address. And if she wants to talk to somebody about the police on the streets of London, I suggest she talks to the Mayor of London.
Fewer Londoners have been murdered this year than at this time last year, but that is of no comfort to the families of the latest victims. To discuss what needs to be done now, not to mention the other issues in his ministerial red box, I'm joined by the Minister for London, Nick Hurd, who's also the Ruislip, Northwood and Pinner MP. Welcome, Nick. Can I ask you first of all, we heard the Prime Minister there make reference to Sadiq Khan. What do you think he needs to do?
Well, we need to support Sadiq. He's the Mayor of London. He's got powers, he's got resources, he's got responsibility. My role as Minister for London is to support him, not least in this joint effort to bear down on this terrible scourge of knife crime, which is devastating in its impact on friends and families and communities, but deeply unsettling for the rest of London.
That tone from the Prime Minister didn't sound very supportive.
Well, let's focus on the positive. I actually think that London is sick and tired of politicians scoring points off each other and pointing fingers of blame at each other. What I'm interested in is trying to find, with Sadiq, a solution to this. Now, I'm an optimist. I look at what's worked in the past, because you'll know, in London, we've been here before, a decade ago. We beat it then, we'll beat it again. We know what works. What works is a combination of tough law enforcement, and that means additional support for the police, more powers for the police. But also alongside that, just as importantly, is investment in that community-based work to try and engage with young people and try and divert them away from bad choices, away from drug dealing, away from crime, away from violence. That's hard work, has to start ever earlier in a child's life now. But that's what we're committed to. That's what we're supporting with additional investment, including additional money to support Sadiq in his work, both for the police and for his violence reduction.
You talk about it working 10 years ago, but 10 years ago we had 33,000 police officers in London. Now there are fewer than 30,000.
Well, the point on that, Simon, is people always trying to make these links to police numbers. And on one level, I understand that. But the fact is, when we last had this big spike in knife crime in London and a similar sense of crisis, we had record levels of police numbers. Last time we saw a fall in knife crime coincided with a fall in police numbers. And that's why I think the point that Theresa May is making, don't insult the complexity of this issue by just reducing it down to a single. It's much more complicated.
But
and
the
solution
refrain I hear every time I go to the scene of a murder are people saying we don't see enough police.
Of course, it's the natural reaction. I hear it in my constituency. It's the natural reaction. Where are the police? But the police themselves are the first to say, look, we are not the long-term solution to this. We can help suppress it with additional officers and more powers, more stop and search. And as your report says, we were beginning to see in the statistics fall in the number of homicides, fall in the number of stabbings. But they're the first to say the solution lies in that public health approach, other partners coming together, schools, hospitals, children's services, local authorities, government coming together to do a better job of identifying young people who are vulnerable to violence and drug dealing and trying to steer them away from it.
It all costs money, doesn't it?
It does need more resources, but in recent weeks we've given Sadiq and the Met additional money to support those officers that were in your report, and I've been out with them. I know how tiring and intensive their work is. There is more money going in to support their work, but also critically alongside that, more money announced this week to support Sadiq's Violent Reduction Unit, which is the hub for this, what we call the public health approach, trying to bring together all agencies for that critical prevention.
The public health idea. I mean, we've seen it's been trialled and used in Scotland successfully. It's taken us a long time to come around to the idea here.
Well, we've been investing in prevention, we've been investing in intervention, but Sadiq and the government have agreed that the public health approach is the right one for London, and we are actively supporting him in setting up the Violence Reduction Unit. It's more complicated than in London than it is in Glasgow, for example. It's a much bigger, more complicated place, but it's being set up.
Is
we are
crime
supporting
more
it
entrenched
actively.
in some communities in London in a way that it isn't in Glasgow?
It's just that London is a much bigger a place to police and to coordinate this work. You're right. You know, the violent crime, the homicides, the knife crime is quite concentrated in London. That's why the efforts of the police with our support are very targeted at what we call hotspots. That's the right thing. And Simon, notwithstanding this terrible week that we've had, which is really upsetting because, every death feels like a defeat. The figures from the Met, as your report shows, do show that homicides came down last year, do show that stabbings came down last year. And now I know statistics are not useful in this kind of environment when we're so shocked and horrified by what we see on our screens and in our newspapers, but there are signs to me that this approach is beginning to have some effect. And my point is that my role is to try and support Sadiq and his administration in this, support the Commissioner in the work, support those officers.
One of the other things the Mayor points out...
And that's what we're doing with money and powers.
One of the things that many people point out when you go to crime scenes is there's not enough for young people to do. Do you accept that austerity cuts to council services has reduced youth provision too far?
We have lost youth services. And I'm a minister set up National Citizen Service. I'm a passionate believer in offering more opportunities for young people to have constructive opportunities to learn new skills and stretch themselves and develop themselves. So I am very keen to see more opportunities for young people in that space, and I'm very keen to support this new investment. We've allocated £200 million of taxpayers' money to this work in communities up and down the country to try and engage young people, help build their trust, to steer them to a different path and deliver the message that if you want to turn your back on violence and crime and drug dealing, we will support you. They need to hear that and they need to believe it.
I noticed you're wearing a Grenfell badge. Can we talk about housing? We had a fire the week before last in Barking, Sandal Garside. There are calls now for the rules about inflammable cladding to be applied to all buildings, not just towers above 18 metres. Do you support that?
Well, Grenfell has got to be, which has been a large part of my life for the last 2 years as Minister for Grenfell Victims, has got to be the catalyst for huge change across a whole number of issues. attitudes towards social housing, but also critically the response to fire safety and the regulation of fire safety, because what it demonstrated, and the subsequent review we commissioned, is that the fire safety system not fit for purpose and needed to be fixed, and that is a very big project.
Who's to blame for it being not fit for purpose?
My assessment is this has accumulated over a number of years and successive governments, and I frankly feel that we got too complacent about fire safety, and that was reflected in regulation and enforcement. Grenfell, the horror of that night, a disaster that should never have happened, has got to be a catalyst for major change in our approach to fire safety and building regulations.
The rules on building regulations and the height of towers with inflammable cladding needs to be looked at?
Yes, well, we're already banning the most combustible cladding on new high-rise buildings.
But low-rise too?
And we're looking at that within the script. The ultimate point, though, here, Simon, is all buildings are meant to be safe, and the owners of those buildings have a responsibility for that safety. What we need to do is tighten up the regulation on that and make sure it's clear who's accountable for it. And that wasn't clear enough, and that's what we're fixing. And that's one of the things that we owe to the victims of the Grenfell disaster, as long as everything else in terms of finding the truth of what happened that night, making sure there's accountability for it, rehousing people, supporting people, setting up an appropriate memorial, all the things that we've got to do, and which I and my colleagues are extremely committed to carrying on.
Nick Hurd, thank you very much for coming in this evening. Now, it won't have escaped your notice that there's a Conservative leadership election underway. Runaway leader of all the stages so far and favourite to become Prime Minister next month is Mr Hurd's parliamentary neighbour, the former London Mayor Boris Johnson. But just who is the man set to become the next occupant of 10 Downing Street?
Ping pong was invented on the dining tables of England, ladies and gentlemen, in the 19th century. It was called whiff-waff. And your colleagues, George Osborne, the dustpan, Michael Gove, the J-cloth, William Hague, the sponge. I was reminded of the Indian light bulb dance that I like to do when I get invited to those family weddings, light bulb, motorbike, motorbike.
Londoners who remember him as mayor might be wondering what happened to the old Boris Johnson. In the City Hall days, the one-liners were his trademark.
Are you saying they haven't the guts to put questions to me?
What
Great
is it?
supine protoplasmic invertebrate jellies.
But in recent weeks, we've seen a new Boris Johnson. The gags have gone, and his City Hall CV has had a makeover.
We cut the murder rate by 50%. We outbuilt Labour with more than 100,000 affordable homes. Cut road traffic fatalities by 50%.
Not surprisingly, his Labour critics view his mayoral achievements in a different light.
I looked at the Garden Bridge project, which cost us tens of millions of pounds that were lost. I looked at the sale of the Olympic site to West Ham, which again was a huge amount, tens of millions of pounds lost to London taxpayers. We looked at the water cannon that was never used.
But not everyone in Labour seems willing to have a pop at him.
I've said whoever becomes the next Prime Minister, it's important that we work together for the benefit of our city and the benefit of our country. I've tried to work closely with Theresa May. I tried to work closely for the short time David Cameron was Prime Minister while I was the Mayor. It's really important where we can, the Mayor of London and the government works together. Where we disagree, of course, we'll disagree.
If the former mayor and current mayor do have to forge a working relationship, it's certain to be tested, not least by Brexit. To discuss what we can expect from a Johnson premiership, I'm joined by the Walthamstow MP, Labour's Stella Creasy, for the Conservatives, Theresa Villas, the Chipping Barnet MP, and for the Liberal Democrats, former London mayoral candidate and former Transport Minister, Baroness Susan Kramer. Welcome, all of you. Theresa, you're backing Boris. What can we expect from a Boris premiership?
Well, as was the case when Boris was Mayor of London, he will lead from the centre ground. I think he'll have a strong focus on tackling crime. As you heard in your package, he had a good record in bringing down the murder rate, and I think that he will be a force for unity. I think he wants to get the Brexit issue sorted so that we can move on from this division, which has been so frustrating for so many people in our city and across the country.
Is that a smile I detect on your face, Stella, or are you about to burst out laughing?
It's an interesting world when Boris Johnson is the unity candidate, a man who arouses strong emotions in so many people, especially in London, not because of the one-liners in the film, but because of of his record, of the money that was wasted, of the projects that didn't happen, of the sense that he might have been a fun character who would hang out in the cable cars, but actually when it came to investing in housing, investing in our transport system, even the deals, as Margaret Hodge was saying, about the London, the Garden Bridge and the Stratford site, actually time and time again, the things that you would want a Prime Minister to be good at, like good public for money and good public planning, he was deficient.
Susan, did you recognise anything that he did as worthy?
I just focus on the fact that 2014, I remember Caroline Pidgeon identifying that beginning of the real spike in youth crime and knife crime. She could not get Boris to focus on it at all and take it seriously, and I think that was such a miss. And also when you look at housing, affordable and social housing in London, under Ken Livingstone the problem was just starting. It ripened under Boris, and many of us went to him, we went to Sir Simon Milton, we went to other people in his administration and said, you've got to get to grips with this problem and quickly. Would they do it? They wouldn't. They built some more social and affordable houses, but they knew it was nothing like the scale that was required. It wasn't on their priority agenda. As far as I'm concerned, they completely let Londoners down.
Can I respond particularly on the transport infrastructure point, Stella? I mean, that Boris's time as mayor saw a phenomenal investment in the capital's transport system, the upgrade of a number of the tube lines, leading to improved reliability on the tube. We also had Crossrail going very well at that stage, no longer now.
Tell me about the cost of the buses. Tell me about the cost of the buses, because the Boris buses were a massive, failed and very expensive present for our transport system. And that's the challenge for me about all of this. Because you're right, Susan, we've had some real challenges and people have seen them. What did Boris do? Rather than actually invest in affordable housing, he changed the definition of affordable. Yes. Now, we can all look at his record, but actually what I'm really worried about and concerned about is what's going to happen in the future. And in particularly on something like Brexit, where we have gone, it's been like Groundhog Day in Parliament, going round and round and again. The sense of, here is a man who likes bluster, but actually when it comes to the detail and finding a way through, planning through that, being good with public money, good with people, do we really think that Boris Johnson on the Council of Europe is going to make things better for Britain or worse? And that's the worrying test for me.
Is he, Theresa? Is he going to get us out at the end of October?
Yes, because he's going to provide some leadership. You know,
This issue, what is this mythical thing called leadership? How does it actually
work? We just got to get it sorted. We cannot carry on with this endless deadlock. You know, the country voted to leave. That's what we have to do. So that's what he's going to do on the 31st of October.
What does that mean?
It means leaving on the 31st of October, deal or no deal. We just have to get this done. We cannot carry on like this.
That's not unifying, that's quite divisive.
Boris is a performer, not a leader. And we saw that absolutely in London. I have to tell you, Theresa, all those transport, that's improvements that you talked about, I was on the board until 2010. I signed off on nearly every one of the ones that you just mentioned.
You're saying they
predate. They
predate Boris.
Absolutely predate. Yeah. And that is the reality. I mean, he was quick to take credit for them. You could never say Boris didn't take credit for anything that anybody else had done. But he was not a leader. We didn't break ground. We didn't move forward as a city, despite a growing population. And I'm afraid we're going to see that same pattern if he's sitting in number 10. He won't be a leader, he won't be breaking ground. And when it comes to unifying, the city became more divided during that time.
If he is Prime Minister, for the Remainers, is it game over?
No. Because the reality of this is people keep saying, well, he'll find a deal through. There is no deal that can be done that will satisfy the Brexiteers. The cry of betrayal is already rising up yet again. So then we're left with your suggestion that we have no deal on October the 31st, and there isn't a majority of support for that. We are heading towards either a general election or a second referendum, as Philip Hammond said today, and the reality is you need a policy for both. And the question for me is, I don't think we're going to find common ground, but what we can agree on is we need a process to work through it. I've had lots of votes on this now as an MP. I just think my community should have a vote instead.
I'm totally with Stella on
Are you absolutely 100% certain, Theresa, that he's going to win his battle to be the next Prime Minister?
Oh no, there can't be any certainty about that. As we all know from leadership elections in the past, the most unexpected results can occur. But it's gone well so far, and I'm absolutely convinced he's the best person for the job.
Stella, this week you spoke about the problems of being an MP and motherhood.
Yes.
What is the problem?
So the problem is, until this week, there was only provision made to cover MPs voting in the House of Commons if they wanted to take... So
this is proxy voting.
I'm pregnant and I would like to be able to take maternity cover so that the work that I do for my community will continue whilst I spend time with a newborn baby. And up until this week, there was no provision made for that. So all the community events, all the casework, all the meetings that we all do in our constituencies across the country, there was no provision made for it to cover it. So I was being asked to choose between making sure that my constituents continue to get the service that they get from me and my team, or spending time with a newborn baby. And that is discriminating against women who are pregnant. It's also discriminating against new fathers too.
Theresa, it's 40 years since we had a woman Prime Minister, first woman Prime Minister. How on earth has it got to this, that nothing has been done about maternity leave?
Well, it has been astonishingly slow. I think Stella is right. We've got to see change because the current system, you're right, isn't fair to new mothers or new fathers, really. We need to reflect the reality of life in modern Britain, and the House of Commons needs to get closer to the standards that apply in regular workplaces right across the country.
You said what has changed until this week. What has changed this week?
So I've met with the Parliamentary Standards Authority and agreed with them a system for myself, because obviously I don't have much time to be able to wait for a consultation to happen. Now we're very clear that we need to do that for all MPs, male and female, and also for MPs' staff. What I'd like to see is parity with the system that IPSA themselves have. So IPSA, as civil servants, have 6 months paid leave that can be shared between the mother and the father. So that's what we're pushing for now for both male and female MPs and the staff who work in Parliament too. So many people have reasons why they don't want to see women in public life. We need to take this as another one of those silly things that people will put up, and I'm sad to say I've had some comments this week about somehow that means that women shouldn't be in politics. We need to take it off the table by making sure there's no barrier to people coming into politics.
Comments made by other politicians?
Well, yeah, and some comments made by other politicians, and also some comments made by people who have very outdated attitudes that somehow it's good for society if only people of a certain age and a certain gender can be in positions of responsibility.
Susan, when you came into politics, did you think that it was going to be harder because you're a woman?
Well, I mean, I was past that age and I came out of the world of finance, which is a pretty tough environment. But that shouldn't be the standard. I mean, Stella is really brave. Jo Swinson was brave. There have been others who have been really brave and moved this on. And this isn't a party issue. I think that, so many of us who are women understand that it is really important to have all of those women's voices there. It's important to be able to serve your constituents. It's important to participate in Parliament. And you should be able to do it and be a mum at the same time without it having to be just incredibly hideous for your family.
Theresa, do you think there are still men in your party that might oppose this?
I haven't canvassed opinion across my colleagues. We've got to get the right kind of reform, but there is no doubt that change is needed, and I'm sure that would have support in my party as it will in others.
So you might not be agreed on Boris Johnson, but I think it's safe to say that all three of you are agreed on this.
Well, look, what I would say to Theresa is if Boris Johnson becomes the Prime Minister, the only thing that will stop this, the parliamentary authorities tell me, is their fear that somehow MPs would oppose it. So
Stella,
this week
I'm afraid we've run out of time, but thank you very much indeed for coming in, all three of you. Thank you to all my guests tonight. We'll be back with another edition of The Late Debate next month. Until then, good night.